Well, Chris, thank you very much. I think I'll take about 10 minutes to kind of respond to your challenge. I think first, enormous congratulations to Sylvia and to the team of Jessica and Claire and others at HelpAge International for what I read as a comprehensive report, as a really strong coverage of the issues, recognising disaster risk management in its kind of fullest sense, right through from some really upstream development issues through to the displacement, the emergency response components. So I think really very well done in that regard. Certainly the kind of the package of things here provides, I think, really strong guidance to governments about what's needed. I think let me just start by putting this kind of day in a little bit of context, as you say, Chris, in that this is the last International Disaster Reduction Day before governments hopefully sign the successor to the Hyogo Framework for Action. I think, therefore, very significant to have ageing and resilience on the agenda, hopefully pushing that front and centre for governments. I think also important to have this in mind is something that links the disasters context with climate change and SDGs. You know, ageing is a key trend in society, as you've highlighted, which means that if we are thinking about resilience across all those policy frameworks, and ageing has to be a key part of that. Now, I'm encouraged by the fact that resilience as a trend that links those together is something that's becoming more front and centre. We only need to look at the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals proposal, to see that under Goal 1, the headline goal of eliminating extreme poverty, we have resilience there as a key headline. And if we're very serious about eliminating extreme poverty, then we need to look at the older population, and we need to stop those trends of impoverishment that push people into poverty, and to think about the sustainability of those trajectories out of poverty. And I think the material that you've presented today highlights some concern about financial inclusion and responsibility of government policy for treating old people's development pathways, and just as the way you might treat young people's development pathways is not maybe in line with where it should be. I think also very important today to recognise we've just had 2 tropical cyclones strike, one in India and one in Japan. We've had severe heat extremes in China. You know, the list goes on. Now, maybe what we've got now is that some of these events do not make our headline news, partly because the number of people being killed may not be lighting up the airwaves. But how often do we get reports back of livelihood destruction, or how people's incomes are changing, or the fact that their pensions aren't accessible, or the fact that we've got large numbers of displacement and those displaced people don't go back home? We don't get these kind of reports. Actually, we're very, as an international media and international kind of news community, very focused on the headline numbers. But let's go back to the case in India today, where we've got so many reports of kind of devastation of infrastructure and of urban structures. And what is the impact then on older people, and how do they change, and how do they survive, and what do they go back to? And at the moment, we do not have that information in the depth that we need to. And wanting to kind of highlight from this report that what I particularly took away was the need for disaggregated data, to look at that data in all stages of the disaster risk reduction initiatives. I think very important to start to understand a bit more of the tapestry of disasters. All well and good to say we've got large numbers of old people being killed in disasters. You talked about Japan, you talked about tsunami, and so. But do we know the data beyond that? Large loss events, and where we focus on mortality is important, and they're eye-catching. But to also look at the understanding of the depth of impact on the well-being of older people too, I think is very important. So, I think a reason why the day is particularly important. I think also just want to highlight some of the trends that we've got in thinking about disasters, and how that fits alongside the trend of ageing. One, we've obviously got growing exposure, simply more people in harm's way. We've got trends in the fact that we've got very persistent vulnerability in parts of the world. We're not necessarily changing that balance between exposure and vulnerability with the speed that we should be. We've got issues of changing extreme weather conditions. At the moment, I think particularly the area of extreme heat is one that we're not fully getting to grips with around the world, where we know from from heat waves in Paris and in London. It is older people who are adversely affected, and more so than other parts of the population. We've not got a handle on extreme heat in many parts of the developing world. And we've got a situation where we know that there's growing displacement. We know that there's a situation where we've got needing to cater for populations displaced from their homes for longer periods of time, and you've highlighted very clearly that older people make up a large margin of that. So we know that the trends that we've got that are shaping our policy context are probably heading against older populations in many ways, and with a growing proportion of the population being older in years, then we need to make sure our policies fully take that into account. I think you've laid out very clearly a very practical agenda for that. I think important to continue that agenda for long periods of time. Not every government's going to jump on board on this and sign up on day one, but very much encourage you to kind of keep going in that regard. Let me just highlight what I see as kind of three major trends in disaster risk reduction internationally that would be good to work on. One, of course, is the whole kind of data component here. Very simple question I think we pose ourselves is, how do we know we're doing well at dealing with disasters? How do we know that we're reducing disaster risk? Now, the most immediate thing people jump to is you say, well, actually, what's the trend in disaster losses? How many fewer people are being killed? What's the impact on GDP and how that's changing? Now, the problem that we've got there, of course, is our data sets over any short period of time are hugely shaped by particular disaster incidences. You might have a 2004 South Asian tsunami in any particular year, which completely changes the landscape. We very rarely adjust for the severity of those hazards. So actually we can't focus on the loss events particularly. We can't focus on trends in disaster deaths over 5 years. It's actually entirely spurious. In any country, you're not simply going to have enough events to make that statistically significant. So one of the changes that we've got to think about is, how do we think about progress? And progress in that regard has to be about looking at disaster risk and the risk of losses rather than loss itself. And that's going to take an understanding, for example, of a set of hazard scenarios in a country and how they may potentially impact on public institutions, for example. Let's take hospitals. What we can't do is look each year and say, well, how many hospitals have been damaged by a disaster event? It doesn't really make much sense. Probably in many years, not many. In other years, it may be a very large amount. But what we can do is run through some scenarios, some synthetic events, and look at the potential impact on those institutions. We need to run early warning systems and think actually how many early warning systems are reaching elderly population. And begin to change the way that we understand progress in resilience building and in disaster risk reduction. I think that's one key shift that we're going to see over the next 10 years and requires disaggregated data from day one. And so if there are ways in which you can work and support countries on developing that disaggregated data and feeding that into a kind of international understandings of progress, I think that's really important. I think the second major shift that I see is that while we've been talking a lot about disaster risk reduction for some time, what we've really meant in terms of policy is improving preparedness, early warning systems, preparedness for response, evacuation planning, things like that. What we've not really thought about, if push comes to shove, is very systematically what risk and resilience means across a rapidly developing society. How do you deal with risk, for example, in land use planning, in the provision of tax and spend policy, in pension planning, in the work that we do to support infrastructure, to move really very much upstream of the problem and think much harder about issues of exposure, issues of vulnerability from the point in which they're created. I think what we have on the table at the moment is a pre-zero draft of the Hyogo Framework for Action that talks about risk creation, risk reduction, and then dealing with residual risk. And it's in that risk creation and the upstream elements of risk reduction where we need to do a lot more work, and to do so in a way that excludes a large portion of the population in the the older population. It would just be complete folly to do that. And so from the very point that our private sector actors or our governments think about risk creation, we need to include older people, whether it's through older people's panels sitting at local government level or the way you described, or right up to the way in which they're recognised in national policy making, all the better. So we have data, the kind of data revolution, something on the creation of risks and focusing more on that. And I think the third element that I would point to in terms of where we're seeing a kind of a seismic shift in disaster policy is actually about the interconnectedness with other shocks. You know, we focused far too long on natural hazards and how they trigger natural disasters in some senses, but actually what's natural is under question, certainly with a link to climate change. We've got a recognition of climate change reshaping the whole dynamics of exposure, vulnerability and hazards. We've got many disasters happening in conflict-affected communities. You know, we have drought in Syria, we have drought in Sudan, we have the interplay of flooding and tropical cyclones in Myanmar. The list goes on. You know, through the late 2000s, we had 50% of all disaster losses occurring in conflict and fragile affected states. So, you know, simply we can't ignore that these shocks are not happening in some kind of vacuum. Often hugely politicized landscape, one where if we're going to tackle resilience in a systematic way, we need to get to grips with some of these other settings. And so we have to answer the difficult questions. How do we deal with disaster resilience in fragile and conflict-affected communities? How do we deal with it in Afghanistan and in Syria, in Somalia and others? Because actually that's where the burden of our responsibility as international citizens is going to lie as this shapes up. As well as asking difficult questions about the negotiation of a climate change treaty and the way in which disasters fit into that. Can we shy away from issues of dealing with loss and damage or financial provision, financial mechanisms? And in all of that, very important to consider key vulnerable populations and key issues of inclusion and exclusion across all of those to make sure that we do so in a coherent sense. So they're kind of three headline trends. I think if I was to pick one particular area which kind of warrants most effort and most kind of potential, I think it would be in the area of the data. I think we need to understand what the problem is in more detail. We need to move beyond saying, oh, well, X number of old people are killed in this event, and isn't that a higher proportion of the population, to understand much more about their lives, the way in which they're included in family life, the way in which their displacement is shaped by social networks that may erode over time, and it's the kind of root of getting to the problem a bit more. That's going to take some time in many countries. Let's even think about the UK. We have some major blockages to data sharing about older people across different public bodies, partly because of issues of data protection issues, but actually when it comes to emergency context, that's really important to simply identify where the vulnerable people of society are, and actually that's something that's really quite difficult if we don't have good data sharing. Just by way of conclusion, I wanted to put an advert out a little bit for future events that we've got here at ODI, which I think are very pertinent to this issue. Next Monday, actually, we host the launch of the World Disasters Report, this year on disasters and culture. Of course, cultural settings hugely important here too. And then Emma, on November the 25th, Claire will be back on the panel here at ODI talking about vulnerability and inclusion in the HFA2. So please do join us then to see older people put alongside disability and young people and others to recognise how we fully create an HFA2 which is inclusive. And then also, if you are interested in the data components, ODI later this week releases a full report on kind of disasters and a data revolution, thinking about how we need to look again at disasters data if we're clear on tracking progress. And just finish again with really very warm congratulations for what is an excellent set of outputs. Thank you, Chris.